Welcome to the grammar video notes for punctuating dialogue. If you don't know what punctuating dialogue means, don't worry, you're about to find out. However, I do want to point out, you know part of this word, punctuating. This sounds a lot like punctuation. So in this video, you're going to learn how to add punctuation to dialogue. All right, let's go ahead and get our supplies ready. You will need your notebook with the video notes glued in. If you don't already have the notes glued in, you can do them separate and glue them in when you're finished. You'll need something to write with, and we're going to be using 4 colors today. You will need your yellow. Oops, that looks green. Let's do this one. You will need your yellow, you will need a blue, you will need a red, and you will need a green. So please go ahead and get those supplies, and when you have them ready, you can unpause the video and continue. So today we're going to be talking about punctuating dialogue. Now earlier I said punctuating means to add punctuation. And then the second word, dialogue, is defined right here. Dialogue just means that a character is talking. So whenever we hear dialogue, I know it means speech. Someone is saying their words. So now moving on to the next spot here, when we're talking about punctuation, it's actually made up of a couple different parts, so I want to talk about that. Character talking in a story is made up of 3 different parts. So will you please start by grabbing your green? The first part we want to talk about is the dialogue. It's what the character says. So here in this sentence below, it says, "I'm joining the track team today," said Kaylee. The dialogue, so what she says is this part, "I'm joining the track team today." That's her dialogue. The second part that we have, go ahead and grab your red, is the dialogue tag. The dialogue tag tells you who is doing the talking. So in this sentence, the part here where it says, "said Kaylee," that's called the dialogue tag. That helps me know who is talking. And often the word that they used helps me know how they were talking. So this sentence is basic. It just says, "said Kaylee," but I could have put "whispered Kaylee" or "shouted Kaylee." So understanding what word it uses to show the talking also helps you know how they said it. All right, go ahead and grab your blue. The third part of character talking is actually the punctuation. There's a lot of punctuation that goes into dialogue. And this can include things like quotation marks and commas or end punctuation. So in this one we have quotation marks around the dialogue. There's a comma at the end of the dialogue, and then there's always that punctuation that happens at the end of a sentence. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to talk about the rules for punctuating dialogue, putting in those quotation marks, knowing when to use commas, and knowing when to use end punctuation. There's one other important thing we need to talk about before we go over the rules, and that's the idea of where the dialogue tag can happen. So the dialogue tag can be at the, go ahead and grab your red. It can be at the beginning. So here I have, Kaylee said, "I'm joining the track team today." They can put the tag at the beginning. It can also be in the middle. "I'm joining the track team," said Kaylee, "today." So the dialogue tag can happen at a pausing point in that sentence. And then the last spot is it can be at the end, like our sentence above. "I'm joining the track team today," said Kaylee. So the dialogue tag can either be at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end. So now let's talk about those steps for punctuating dialogue. Step 1 tells you to use quotation marks. Go ahead and grab your blue. We're going to be using quotation marks, and the rule is that you put it around each piece of dialogue. So if you look up above, here's my sentence. "I'm joining the track team today," said Kaylee. Here's the dialogue. Here's what she said. And you'll notice that there are quotes on either side of it. It's like you're using the quotes to kind of grab the dialogue and hold it all together. The second step comes in, it's more punctuation. The second step says use commas if the sentence continues, or end punctuation if the sentence ends after each piece of dialogue or each dialogue tag. So I'm going to be modeling that in a few minutes, but we have to have punctuation after each piece of dialogue that we've grabbed with quotation marks and after each dialogue tag. Kind of keeps each of those pieces contained. Now go ahead and swap out for your yellow. We haven't used this one yet. The last piece is that you have to use capitals, and you can use them at the start of a sentence, which we already know, or the start of the dialogue. And I'll be showing you what that looks like in just a moment. Let's keep that yellow crayon, and we're going to go back into some of our existing sentences, and we're going to point out those capitals. So up here at the top with our main sentence, I've got a capital at the beginning where it says I'm, because that's the start of the sentence. There's also a capital for Kaylee's name, but I'm not identifying that one because it doesn't have to do with dialogue. We'd always capitalize the name. And then in this middle section where it says about the dialogue tag being at the beginning, the middle, or the end, I wanted to point out here I have a capital at the beginning, and yes, it's her name, but also it's the beginning of the sentence. And then there's a capital for I'm. Now, part of it is because the word I'm always is capitalized, but also it's the beginning of the dialogue, so it would have a capital. The same thing in the middle, capital at the beginning of your sentence, but notice not a capital here on the word today because I'm continuing that spoken sentence. And then the same thing when it's at the end. We're going to have a capital at the beginning of the sentence. So these are the steps for punctuating dialogue. Let's go ahead and move on to the next page and start practicing using those steps. All right, so over here it asks us to use the steps for punctuating dialogue to correctly add punctuation to the text below. And we have this whole back and forth conversation. That's a bunch of dialogue, but it doesn't have its punctuation yet. So let's go ahead and add that in. If you look over at our steps over here, step 1 tells us to use quotation marks around each piece of dialogue. So looking over here at the first sentence or sentences, it says, "My family is making hot pot for dinner," said David. "Do you want to come?" We need to figure out where the talking is happening and where the dialogue tag is. So I'm going to grab my green, and it says, "My family is making hot pot for dinner," said David. So this part is talking. My family is making hot pot for dinner. And then it says, "said David," and then it says, "do you want to come?" So these are the two things David said. He said, "My family's making hot pot for dinner," and "do you want to come?" Which means the "said David" part is my dialogue tag. Now that we've split it up, we can go ahead and use our pen or pencil, and we're going to put quotation marks around the things that were said. So we can put them around, "My family is making hot pot for dinner," and "do you want to come?" That's step 1. Step 2 says use commas if the sentence continues, or end punctuation if the sentence ends after each piece of dialogue or each dialogue tag. So if I go ahead and look up here in our sentence, I have, "My family is making hot pot for dinner," said David. That's really one sentence. So I can end my sentence with punctuation, and also I have to have punctuation at the end of my dialogue. Since I don't want the sentence to end, I don't want it to say, "My family is making hot pot for dinner," said David, right? I want to continue the sentence. I'm going to put a comma so that my reader knows that's the end of the dialogue. There's a tag coming. And then I look at this next sentence, "do you want to come?" That's its own sentence, so I'm going to put a question mark to end that sentence. All right, and then step 3 tells us we need to use a capital at the start of a sentence or the start of the dialogue. So going back to our sentence, "My family is making hot pot for dinner." That one already had a capital because it was the beginning. "Said David" doesn't need a capital. It's not dialogue. It's a dialogue tag. And then here's more dialogue in a new sentence. Do you want to come? So I need to turn that into a capital D because it's a new start of a sentence. Do you want to come? So we found the dialogue in the dialogue tag. We put quotes around the parts that were spoken, and we made sure there's punctuation at the end of each piece of dialogue and at the end of each dialogue tag. All right, let's check out his reply. David just asked him if he wants to come to dinner to have hot pot. Daquan replied, I wish I could, but I have piano lessons today. All right, so we know he's talking about how he can't go over for dinner. Let's grab our green for dialogue and our red for dialogue tag. It starts off with Daquan replied. We can do that one in red. That's our dialogue tag. And then in green, we can underline what he said. I wish I could, but I have piano lessons today. All right, so we found that. Now we can go ahead and put our quotes around the words that were said. His words were, I wish I could, but I have piano lessons today. Now we need to put punctuation at the end of the tag and at the end of the dialogue. So here it says, Daquan replied. I don't want that to be the end of the sentence. I want that to lead into the dialogue. So that's just going to have a comma. And it says, I wish I could, but I have piano lessons today. That's the end of my sentence, so I need to end it with end punctuation. And in fact, when I look at that sentence, I should also have a comma here. I wish I could, comma, but I have piano lessons today. That's one of our fanboy conjunctions that we learned about earlier that has a comma in front of it. All right, so I can double check. Quotes around my speech, punctuation at the end of each tag and at the end of the sentence, and make sure my sentences start with capitals and my dialogue starts with capitals. All right, let's keep going. Are you working on something specific? Said David. I wonder if he's asking about the piano lessons. All right, let's grab green and we'll grab David's words. He said, are you working on something specific? And then in red, our tag is, said David. Okay, we figured out what's dialogue and what's dialogue tag. We could put quotes around the dialogue. Now we need to punctuate each dialogue and each dialogue tag. Are you working on something specific? Ooh, that sounds like a question. Since that one's a question, I'm going to put a question mark. In dialogue, I'm allowed to put a question mark even if it's not the end of a sentence, which can be confusing. Are you working on something specific? Said David. And then I can end that sentence. And then I'll check, did my sentence start with a capital? Yep. And did the dialogue start with a capital? Yep, since it's the start of the sentence. Ooh, the next one is long. I wonder if we're going to have to break that up into multiple sentences. Let's see what it says. I'm working on a new song for my recital next month. It's supposed to be really challenging, but my piano teacher said I'm ready for it. I hope he's right, said Daquan. Yeah, there's a lot of talking in there. Let's take a look at it. This time I'm going to try not underlining all the dialogue. I'm just going to try to find the dialogue tag. I'm working on a new song for my recital next month. It's supposed to be really challenging, but my piano teacher said I'm ready for it. I hope he's right, said Daquan. So this is my dialogue tag, which means the rest of it is all dialogue. That means that there are multiple sentences in there we're going to have to break up. I'm working on a new song for my recital next month. Period, which means that's a capital. It's supposed to be really challenging. Oh, and there's one of those fanboy conjunctions. It's supposed to be really challenging, but my piano teacher said I'm ready for it. And there's already a capital for the word I. I hope he's right, said Daquan. Now, we have here, I hope he's right, said Daquan. I don't want to end the sentence there. I want to add that dialogue tag. So I'm going to put a comma and then end punctuation here. And then I can check to make sure, does my dialogue start with a capital? Yes, it does. So that sentence is good. Wow, said David. That sounds cool. I can't wait to hear you play it. So let's grab our red and find the dialogue tag. David's the one talking, so we have said David. Now we can put quotes around any of his talking. He said, wow. And then he said, that sounds cool. I can't wait to hear you play it. Now we need to add our end punctuation. Now I could have a sentence, wow, said David. That sounds cool. I could have that dialogue tag be in the middle. So I can say, wow, comma, said David, comma, that sounds cool, period. That way my dialogue tag's in the middle. I can't wait to hear you play it. Maybe we'll end that one with an exclamation mark. All right, so we did some really challenging punctuation work here. We looked at each piece of punctuation each piece of dialogue and figured out where was the talking and where is the tag. We made sure to put quotes around the talking, and we ended each series of quotation marks with punctuation, and we ended each dialogue tag with punctuation. Now, if you read through this and your end punctuation looks slightly different, that's okay. There can be different ways to do that. Like the last sentence where I had, wow, said David, and I have all that commas. I could have ended that sentence sooner and used end punctuation. So there's a lot of freedom in how you use this. The most important part is to make sure that any words that are spoken are in quotation marks and that every piece of dialogue and every dialogue tag ends with a comma or end punctuation. For this last part, you get to get creative. I'm not going to do this part for you, and be careful. If you turn in your notes with this part blank, I will have to mark it incomplete. So this last part asks you to use these rules to write your own dialogue. It says, complete each writing task using correctly punctuated dialogue. The first one says, write a piece of dialogue where, oops, there's a typo. Will you fix it for me? Cross it out if yours is like mine. Write a piece of dialogue where Tanya asks a friend if she wants some chips. So it could go something like this. Do you want some chips? Asked Tanya. And then you have to correctly punctuate the dialogue. Beneath it, it says, write a piece of dialogue where a kid tells what he wants to do at recess. So a kid could say something like, I want to play Foursquare at recess, said Mikey. And then you have to punctuate it correctly. You can keep these simple or get really creative, but make sure that you keep going back to our steps for punctuating dialogue, and I encourage you to use the color coding if you're not quite sure. All right, good luck.